As organizações não governamentais para o desenvolvimento, também conhecidas como ONGD, são instituições sem fins lucrativos que trabalham em 3 áreas: a cooperação para o desenvolvimento, a educação para a cidadania global e a ação humanitária e de emergência. A cooperação para o desenvolvimento, que visa combater as desigualdades sociais e económicas de forma sustentável e duradoura, através de um esforço levado a cabo conjuntamente pelas pessoas dos países desenvolvidos e as pessoas dos países em desenvolvimento. A educação para a cidadania global, que visa a compreensão das causas dos problemas de desenvolvimento e das desigualdades locais e globais, num contexto de interdependência, através de ações de sensibilização, de formação e de influência política. A ação humanitária e de emergência, que visa não só aliviar os efeitos imediatos de catástrofes naturais, como tsunamis ou terremotos, e humanas, como guerras e conflitos violentos, mas também contribuir para a prevenção de catástrofes e para o reforço da capacidade das populações de reagir, resistir e reabilitar. A intervenção das ONGD baseia-se nos princípios da solidariedade, dignidade e direitos humanos, justiça social, parceria, participação, sustentabilidade e transparência. A Plataforma Portuguesa das ONGD agrupa mais de 60 ONGD e representa-as como interlocutora privilegiada junto de organizações nacionais e internacionais. Procura contribuir para melhorar a qualidade nos domínios da cooperação para o desenvolvimento, educação para a cidadania global e a ação humanitária e de emergência, através de atividades de comunicação, formação, monitoria e advocacy, e potencia as capacidades das suas associadas, fomentando uma cultura de partilha e responsabilização. Contando já com 30 anos de atividade, a plataforma trabalha para uma sociedade civil organizada, plural, independente e coesa, que contribui para o bem comum e um mundo mais justo.
This conference is co-financed by the European Commission and Camões IP, which results from a partnership between 6 national NGDO platforms representing previous, current and future presidencies of the EU Council between 2019 and 2021, and Concord. The COVID-19 pandemic deepened already existing challenges and highlighted the need for structural transformation in our societies. From the impacts of climate change to the increasing of inequalities, the pandemic made it impossible to ignore that global challenges can only be met through genuine cooperation between all countries and sectors. In a key moment for the EU-African relationships, and in turn, in the run-up, to the next AU-EU summit, the conference, a partnership of equals, Africa-EU relationship in an increasingly complex world, aims to discuss the fundamental principles that should be at the core of a genuine and meaningful partnership, focusing on its potential to promote people-centered policies. During the conference, the study European Union and Africa towards a partnership of equals will be presented and shared with the audience. Please take note that this conference will be streamlined in English on the platforms of Facebook and YouTube pages. So if you have other people who want to watch what is going on today, you can refer them to these different pages. We have a very interesting and diverse program for you today. We have an opening, as you can see, that's what we are doing now. And afterwards, we'll have a keynote address, followed by a very interesting presentation by Ian Mengel about the EU-Africa Civil Society Survey. Afterwards, we'll have a panel discussion, and obviously we'll also have a lunch break. For those of you who are in the Portuguese time zone, that will be at 12 o'clock. For the other ones, it will be at 1 o'clock. The afternoon will also be packed with interesting contributions, some panels, and we will have a closing at 4:15. Today, again, Portuguese time, this will be 5:15 if you are in the Central European time zone. You will be able to communicate in the chat box. You will find a button underneath your screen that says chat box, where you will be able to interact during the session, ask questions for the debate, and there's also a Q&A option, which you will be able to see on the same bar as the chat function. The call for participation in the poll will be launched in the end of the event, so stick with us until then, so you can also take part in this poll. That's a little bit what we have in store for you today. I suggest we get down to business, and I would like to introduce your first speaker, and that is Patricia Fonseca. She has a degree in sociology, and for 12 years already, she has been the coordinator of the Department of Education and Development, Social Advocacy and Communication at the FEC. She's responsible for managing, operationalizing, monitoring, and evaluating advocacy projects and initiatives with policymakers both from the national level and the European level, and this within the scope of the 2030 agenda, because the 2020 agenda would already be over, human rights, global citizenship, policy conference for development. The center also develops education programs for development and global citizenship and coordinates public interest communication campaigns in the areas in which it works, like promoting sustainable lifestyles, climate justice, human rights, with a special focus to human rights to adequate food. And of course, sustainability and children's rights. Voila, that's a lot of responsibilities for Patricia. I'm happy to pass the word to you, and I will see you a little bit later.
Bom dia, thank you, Sven. Obrigada. Em nome da plataforma.
Good morning. Thank you, and on behalf of the Portuguese NGDO platform, I welcome you all to the conference, A Partnership of Equals, Africa-EU Relations in an Increasingly Complex World. This conference is being held under the project Towards an Open, Fair and Sustainable Europe in the World in the context of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the EU. I wish to begin by greeting the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Francisco André, and our speakers who have joined us from all parts of the world, in particular from Africa and Europe. Welcome. The day today is the culmination of a process that we tried to create a program for today that integrates different stakeholders in this relationship, EU and African relationship. Thus, we will have with us today policymakers, officials of public institutions with a role in paving the way for the coming years, and citizens of the two continents, because we are counting on the audience to ask questions during the sessions. We have always insisted on the importance of creating moments of discussion like these. It is in this way that, in our view, that this is an important part of the process of setting the solutions for addressing the challenges that lie ahead. We believe that today it is even more important to create the appropriate forum in order to honestly and openly contribute towards a well-balanced partnership between the EU and Africa, focused on a fundamental concern, sustainable development and the dignity of people. And for that, we believe that it is paramount to foster the conditions for an inclusive dialogue. And this is why we wanted to hold this conference. Furthermore, we wanted to foster a discussion about the main concerns identified by civil society in the context of EU-Africa relations. In the study that we today introduced by the Portuguese platform of NGDOs, developed by consultants Patricia, Magalhães Ferreira and Andrea Oliveira, it introduces trends and challenges in the development of cooperation. The analysis is founded on the need to change the paradigm of relationship and the transition towards from a aid-centered approach towards an approach focused on a partnership between equals. The goal of the study was to assess whether objective conditions are in place for the implementation of a more equal and balanced partnership. EU-Africa relationships has evolved in configurations based on different formal partnerships, strategies and instruments, sometimes which overlap and have little coordination between them. And this relationship has essentially been focused on different pillars. On the one hand, the new agreement of the relationship between EU and African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, approved in April 2021, and on the other hand, the EU strategy for Africa in 2020 that we hope will contribute to a new joint strategy for the future. Notwithstanding the recurrent narrative of a partnership of equals, the fact is that EU-Africa relationships have been markedly asymmetrical. And although we have seen some development towards a clearly more pragmatic and geopolitical approach, the EU approach has been increasingly focused on mutual interests and benefits. On the African side, the interest of other external partners and the strengthening of the African Union itself has been contributing to a diversification of opportunities and to a greater ambition of African positions and its negotiating space, which could be better used in the ongoing reflection on its external partnerships, including with the EU. However, the transition towards a more geopolitical approach on behalf of the EU can incur risks, particularly in the relationship with Africa and in particular with populations, more vulnerable populations. In the EU, growing focus on domestic interests such as migration that is addressed from a securitization and quite frankly perverse perspective tend to invade the dynamics of relationships with Africa and risk diluting the centrality of poverty eradication as the core goal of EU development policy. A more equal partnership and more balanced partnership is also related to the conditions for exercising concrete partnership, an effective partnership through decision-making, governance and joint management mechanisms. However, changes in the functioning of some European financial instruments following the approval of the multi-annual financial framework may accrue some challenges because it draws third countries away from the impacting decisions. In our view, this is what, for example, the European Development Fund, or the inclusion of the European Development Fund in the EU budget seems to suggest, or the elimination of instruments that benefited from joint mechanisms such as the European Peace Facility clearly set out. So we still have a lot of room for improvement, the way we work and hold discussions with the EU and Africa in view of the development of a partnership between equals. Therefore, civil society as an essential player for development is an essential player in EU and Africa partnerships. However, its involvement is still far from being inclusive, broad and effective. The work developed by Venro highlights existing gaps at this level. This renewed relationship thus brings new opportunities for more effective mechanisms for consultation and dialogue with civil society. At this conference, we have sought to ensure the presence of civil society representatives from the two continents, and thus we hope to contribute to the consolidation of this dialogue that we intend it to be inclusive. We believe that it is through a more inclusive approach we may bring the EU-Africa partnership closer to people. We hope that these relations be fair and that decisions may focus clearly on European and African citizens in view of creating a positive impact on human development, which is the ultimate goal of this relationship. This study that we today will introduce includes several recommendations addressed at the EU and in particular at Portugal, which is currently holding the Council presidency. And we hope that together we may contribute to promoting a better EU-African relationship based on mutual cooperation and co-responsibilization and partnerships, coherent and inclusive, equal and sustainable partnerships. Once again, we welcome all of our speakers to this conference, whose input will be certainly invaluable. Thank you very much, Ana Patricia, for your valuable considerations.
Several languages, and in case you don't know where to find the translation button, it's also next or close to the chat button in the bottom of your screen. We have another person who would like to welcome you to this conference, and that is Francisco André. He's the Portuguese Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. In the past, he has been the head of the Office of the Secretary of State to the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, that was between 2005 and 2008, and he also has been the Counselor in the Permanent Representation of Portugal to the European Union between 2009 and 2013. The head of the Prime Minister's Office from October 2018 to August 2020, and he also served as Chief Technical Advisor at the Permanent Representation of Portugal to the OECD between September and December 2020. As you can see, plenty of experience both in the national and the international European sector. Mr. Secretary of State, I would like to pass the word to you.
Muito bom dia a todos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin by greeting all participants in this conference, and obviously, in particular, Ana Patricia Fonseca, the president of the Portuguese platform of ONGDs, which is a partner institution of Portuguese cooperation. Allow me to also greet the speakers of the other panels who will be with us today, and also to congratulate you on this study on EU and African partnerships. The need for a partnership between equals and between Europe and Africa it goes without saying. We are talking about two regions, sovereign states, which are different amongst themselves, but also we are talking about two continental unions, the African Union and the European Union. And this is why the need to highlight parity and equality of this partnership is so important, because it is a partnership between equals in effect. It was for many years unbalanced. It was not a partnership between equals, as Anna Patricia mentioned, but we are talking about the past. This is something that we have managed to overcome. And especially because this is not what Europe wants, and it is not what Africa wants. And above all, it's not what European and African citizens want. So undoubtedly, traditional cooperation partners, which were paramount in the past, are now outdated. And this is why our daily dialogue with African partners, we hear very clear messages that they need investment, knowledge, the sharing of technology, the creation of jobs and wealth, less barriers to international trade, and obviously acknowledgement, both in thesis and in practice, of the lawful place that they can occupy in international policy. And this is why in this partnership we find both European and African entities. But we live in a very complex world with a lot of bureaucracy, red tape. And this is why we must try to overcome this and make an attempt to avoid and overcome this approach in the past and strive towards this common goal. On the European end, the commitment is unequivocal. And Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission chairman, left this very clear when the European Commission assumed dialogue with Africa as a priority of its mandate. And this is why today we must discuss, address, and above all, build a common partnership between equals on common goals that combines all stakeholders, including from the private sector, to create synergies and to be able to achieve the best possible results. And one essential element in this partnership is to be able to listen. And it's not an always easy exercise, because there are many countries on both sides with different interests, and even within the two blocks, the European and the African blocks, we have different countries with different institutional architectures and which find themselves in different stages of development as far as cooperation policies are concerned. But when we are fully committed to the development of such a partnership and the development of tools for this dialogue, it is possible to overcome these barriers. Let me give you an example. During the Portuguese presidency semester, we organized as one of the main events related to Africa, a month of discussion between EU and Africa for cooperation and green transition. During this month, we managed to hold more than 25 sessions, which we called Green Talks, online seminars where African and European capitals to discuss a very easy but very important topic. How can we have green companies and business models without forfeiting jobs and wealth? Some of these green talks were held in Lisbon in April. Actually, you can access and listen to all of the sessions on the YouTube of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Portuguese government. And this was so important because we counted on the participation of more than 10,000 participants in a month. And this was the first time in a very long time that we managed to organize a structured discussion with responsible African countries, African countries and the representatives, responsible representatives of those African countries and many non-governmental organizations, representatives of civil society, to listen to them and to be able to draw the best conclusions in order to move forward. I think that this contributed to an effective partnership. We listened to both sides and we realized that both the EU and African Union, one of the biggest top concerns is the environmental concerns. And therefore, during the Portuguese presidency of the EU, we tried to create a forum like this one. And in spite of all of the restrictions, or in spite of all of the constraints in the current context, this was an excellent example how it is possible to hold a forum in order to be able to implement effectively this partnership. One of the main conclusions drawn was the formal conclusions of the post-Cotonou period, but also the approval of this new financial instrument, the Indício in English, Global Europe, as we call it in Portugal. So this is the right way forward to discuss, to hold dialogues, discussions, develop instruments like these. This is a very meaningful instrument to which 30 million euros was allocated to sub-Saharan Africa, and almost 30% of the total instrument is allocated to climate actions. So a good example of an excellent working instrument, particularly in such an important area like climate change and everything related to that, food safety, energy, the need that we have to endow different stakeholders with the right means to address climate change, extreme phenomena, natural disasters. And all of this has instigated the ingenuity of Europeans and Africans. The current pandemic, has made us realize how important it is to tackle climate change. And this is why we felt it was so important to create this platform of dialogue that will translate it into sessions over a month, but will continue and will translate into many more activities. But we need to move forward, reinforcing relations between EU and Africa for a better understanding amongst ourselves, amongst our institutions. The dialogue that we need to foster between the two continents cannot exhaust itself at the events between our decision makers. This is why we need to increasingly hold inventive, creative events and discover new forms of collaboration and dialogue. And we know that under this dialogue, we will always find points of agreement and elements of disagreement. In the few elements in which we do not see eye to eye with Africa, which actually we see in our dialogue with many other parts of the world, are often reinforced and highlighted by the media, which often forgets the many other points in which we see eye to eye, on which we agree with, and which unite us. Portugal, in its or through its European external policy, has sought to reinforce and to focus on these points in common. This is why we always try to build bridges between partners in all levels. And to conclude, because I do not want to bore you anymore, allow me to conclude on a brief note. On one of these planes or platforms of discussion is civil society, where NGOs, Portuguese and European NGOs, have played a fundamental role. And I would like to leave you with a word of greeting and particularly acknowledging the work carried out by Portuguese NGOs, in particularly the Portuguese platform. They have been relentless in their efforts to play the role as institutional partners of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Camões Institute, our cooperation agency. They're an excellent example of how we have to work in collaboration with our partners in the world. And they are an excellent example, encouraging others to work in these areas. In areas like education and health in countries like São Tomé and Guinea-Bissau, they are indispensable. They are also at the forefront when it is necessary also to support misplaced individuals in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. A month ago, we launched a line of projects of humanitarian aid that was then awarded to Portuguese NGOs acting in Mozambique to support misplaced persons in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. But there are NGOs who work in the fight against climate change in Cabo Verde, for example. So we are well aware that it is through complementary work between civil society, European institutions and governments that cooperation can be taken to a whole new level. And only in this way may the partnership with Africa develop, evolve, but particularly with a focus on the partnership between equals, just as is highlighted in the study and will certainly be highlighted at the meeting today. So I would like to welcome, congratulate the platform of NGOs on their excellent work, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Of State for being with us, and of course also for sharing some reflections with us. And we have another guest. Well, actually we have a virtual guest. The Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, could not make it today, unfortunately, but she sent us a recorded video especially for this event, which we will be able to see in a moment. Ms. Jutta Urpilainen, she oversees the European Commission work on international cooperation and sustainable development, and she is a strong advocate for gender equality, social justice, and youth participation. She has a long history in Finnish policy, and she is very passionate about Europe Already since her youth, she has chaired many NGOs in her home country, including the UN Association of Finland. As said, unfortunately, she could not make it, but we have a video from her where we will look at now.
Dear friends, we indeed live in an increasingly complex world. Democracy has been in decline for a decade. COVID-19 has made matters worse. The EU is working hard for a green, sustainable and inclusive global recovery. A recovery with people, human development and in particular education in its heart. This cannot be accomplished alone. We need you, a strong, determined civil society, by our side. We will continue work with you as our dedicated 1.5 billion euros allocation to CSOs in our new financing instrument demonstrates. There is also substantial consultation ongoing at different levels in the context of programming, notably through the Policy Forum on Development. Dear colleagues, Africa is a priority of this geopolitical commission. Our new partnership with Africa will be innovative and transformational as we work with non-governmental organizations. Our continued collaboration towards the 6th AU-EU summit taking place next year will be crucial. The Africa-EU Civil Society Forum, to be held back-to-back with the summit, will be a particularly important moment. I want to make sure young citizens are heard and are part of decision-making. And this is why I'm setting up youth sounding boards and will soon nominate a special advisor on youth. We will listen to youth as what we are trying to build is their future. Our youth action plan, which we will adopt next year, will guide us. Women and girls must also be central to our efforts to building back better. 2 out of 3 girls in sub-Saharan Africa drop out after primary school. This is devastating for the girls themselves, but also to development at large. We must change this, and we will. The EU will continue to contribute to empowering women and girls. At least 85% of our actions under the long-term budget will promote gender equality in line with our ambitious EU Gender Action Plan. Dear friends, with you by our side, EU international partnerships can change people's lives for the better. I look forward to the outcome of your discussions today and to continuing this journey together.
Okay, that was a contribution from the EU Commissioner. We move on to our next speaker, and that will be Awad Sakin Ahmad. And he serves as the permanent representative of the African Union to the EU and the ACP states. The ambassador has a vast diplomatic experience and has held several positions, including Minister of Finance of Chad and Ambassador of Chad to South Africa. Mr. Awad Sakin Ahmad, I would like to give you the floor now.
Merci, merci, Monsieur Sven.
Bienvenue.
Et merci aussi à Madame Anna Patricia, qui assure la présidence.
Thank you very much, Sven. And thank you very much, Anna Patricia, President of the Portuguese platform that plays such an important part in EU and African relations. And also thank you very much, Secretary of State. I wish to ensure here that you can count on the support of the African Union. I would also like to welcome all participants to this meeting. That will certainly be a landmark in EU-AU relations. We have a common destination, and speaking of common destination, this is the destination of the two continents' institutions, but also of its peoples. I think it's very important to discuss and exchange ideas between all stakeholders, including civil society. Governments have a very important part to play, but civil society must overall participate. And also the Pan-African, African, European, Portuguese parliaments. I think that is essential. We need to understand the status quo in all countries. You have partnerships with Africa, Caribbeans and Caribbean countries on the one side, but also we have the strategic Lisbon Agreement in 2007 that triggered a very effective cooperation between the two continents. As Commissioner and Patricia highlighted, we together are very much engaged in a partnership for equals. Sorry. We need to come out of the donor beneficiary paradigm. I believe that today Africa cannot live without Europe and vice versa. We count on a partnership with Europe, and Europeans should also seize this a greater openness and the large area, large space that Africa and the African Union has to offer to engage in the development of a prosperous Africa. Do you really believe that today we can achieve sustainable development and create jobs for young men and women and ensure equality between gender if we do not engage in the industrialization of Africa? That is not possible. But if we work together, if we join hands, that will be achievable, but we need to think about the consequences of development through the continental free trade area. We're talking about 1 billion inhabitants. Africa's first trade partner, Europe, must seize this opportunity to invest in Africa for transformation, which in turn will allow the skilled young European men and women to invest in Africa. We don't need to create offices and institutions to communicate. Countries have their particularities, their individual complexities, but we need to create internal initiatives to change things. Now is the time for the European Parliament and the African Union to hold talks, to engage in a cooperation that I must say was not well negotiated. The President of the Commission and the President of the African Union, as well as Commissioner Justa, all agree that we need to engage in a cooperation between equals. And how can we do that? Well, we need to understand the value and accept the value of the African continent and the value of the European continent and the role that civil society can play. Furthermore, and before I conclude, I must say that we need to look and address these issues face to face. What does Africa need? What is it looking for? Security, for example. Today, Africa and Europe have a common destination from a bilateral perspective. From a global perspective, we can also join hands to address bilateral matters so that Africa and Europe can speak openly and thus be engaged at the global level. How can we help youth find jobs? I've always talked about job creation, but how is that possible? Well, only through industrialization. Africa is an open continent. If Europeans are not seizing this opportunity, then they will leave a vacancy for others who will seize this opportunity in Africa. There are cooperation instruments available. We have always had cooperation founded on European investment funds, but I believe that continental cooperation must be founded on financial instruments, which will in turn finance development and implement a control system that will. Well, we cannot simply give out financing without accountability. And I would like to highlight the African strategy set up by the European Union, and that highlights a few priorities. And on our end, Africa Union should also be able to share with Europe its priorities. Another thing is what we have to do to ensure the financing of such priority projects. All stakeholders, NGOs, civil society, youth, men and women must together join hands to converge towards a cooperation of equals. And I wanted to precisely focus on this initiative now. I believe that it is the first time that a non-governmental organization invites different stakeholders to get together to meet with a very heavy, dense agenda to discuss the EU-African cooperation. Thank you very much. I congratulate you on your initiative.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, pour partager votre perspective. We will continue.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Last keynote speaker before we move into a panel discussion. And the last contribution you have from Ian Mengel, who will present the key findings of the Africa-EU Civil Society Survey. Ian Mengel works for the VENRO department, and VENRO is an umbrella organization of development and humanitarian NGOs in Germany. He has lived in Nigeria and Uganda for several years, working in areas of environmental justice and peace building. Ian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. Thank you also to all the speakers who have really highlighted how much we need closer cooperation and dialogue. And that's exactly what we will present to you now the Africa-Europe Civil Society Survey wanted to find out about the state of our cooperation. Thank you for Plataforma for bringing us together again. It's a series of different conferences that have already taken part, and I think we should continue in this line. So this survey has been conducted by Plataforma, by the Slovenian colleagues Sloga, by Concord and Fenro, organizations that make up the trio that accompanies Portugal, Germany, and Slovenia in this 18-month trio presidency. And the question was, how does civil society understand the Africa-Europe cooperation, and how familiar are civil society actors with the official partnership between Africa and the EU? So just to take you through the results briefly, the context and the reason for this survey was that the EU actually declared Africa as a priority for 2020, and the EU summit was planned for October. Unfortunately, it was postponed then, but still we felt that it is important to find out if civil society actually knows enough about the partnership to get engaged. So we wanted to find this out through a series of questions, and hopefully also contribute to a stronger involvement of civil society in EU affairs. Just briefly, the methodology. There was a Research Opinion Institute from Germany helped us to conduct an online survey, which was available in 3 languages for 10 days. So you see the numbers here. There's quite a number of participants, over 360 participants from Africa and Europe, many different countries. But of course, we have to say that it is not representative of civil society as such. Would like to advocate with the EU Commission and the EU that maybe bigger numbers can also be achieved at a later point. So we started with very general questions to find out how important actually do you think are the relations between Africa and Europe. And as you can see, almost 100% of people think that it is very important, and the relations should be strengthened. But there's always a but. Many of the participants found that the cooperation itself at the moment is not actually working very well. You might notice there's a difference between participants in Africa and in Europe. So maybe European civil society is more skeptical at the moment, whereas more participants in Africa actually feel that the cooperation is going quite well. We now wanted to find out in part 2 which priorities should this cooperation focus on, and I believe that's also interesting to see that political actors and civil society might not be in line always when it comes to priorities. So what, for example, in a European perspective, could be migration and digital transformation and green transition as the most important issues, does not figure out prominently, but most participants actually concentrated on the issue of sustainable growth and jobs, that they believe should be at the center of African-European relations. I'll leave you a minute with this. And coming closer, taking a closer look, you can see, of course, that there are many, many ideas. We had over 200 written statements, very detailed suggestions how to work in these areas. This is just a snapshot and definitely deserves more attention from policymakers as well. But one striking example could be good governance and transparency as being a very, very important issue for many civil society actors on both continents. We then tried to find out how do you rate the structures and participation, the official structures between AU and EU, and how familiar are you with the Africa-Europe partnership? And as you can see, many civil society actors are not very familiar with the official partnership. So it is good to know that there are continued efforts, as the Commissioner also stated, and State Secretary from Portugal, Mr. André. But still, it seems that there's a lack of information about the partnership and about its key elements. For example, when it comes to the already mentioned Civil Society Forum, almost 3/4 of participants have never heard of it, and even only 3% have actually dealt with it intensively. So it might be interpreted as a sign of lack of information, maybe, but also that these structures are not very actively promoted. One of the next questions we asked was, would you like to be more involved in these partnerships? And as you can see, yes, there's a great eagerness of civil society actors to take part actively in EU relations, and bilaterally, of course, among civil society actors themselves, but also through governments, also through the continental bodies. And I think that's a very good sign that civil society is really into it. And these are some of the answers how this could be achieved. So how could the involvement look like? Some of these issues were also mentioned before, and the AU-EU summit definitely should be a very key event that could help to deepen exchange, learning, dialogue between all actors. So I was asked to keep it brief, just a very few last comments. So there's a strong desire, as I said, and we also found out that a lot of civil society actors think that even if we cannot meet, as now for the COVID pandemic, digital tools as used today could help us to actually deepen our dialogue. And if you are interested to find out more, you can read the whole survey on our presidency website, as you can see here. Please make use of it, get into contact, and we will be very ready to share all the results with you. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Jan. And with that, we have our last individual speaker of this morning, and we will move to a panel discussion about genuine and meaningful Africa-EU partnership. The panel will be moderated by Josiane Gauthier. She's a Canadian lawyer with over 20 years of experience in international development and solidarity, and she is the Secretary General of SITSE. SITSE is an international family of 18 Catholic social justice organizations in Europe and Northern America. Josiane, I'm happy to give you the word and the reins of this panel conversation that will happen in the next time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sven. So we've had a lot of information, and so we want to digest it perhaps, but we have some really lovely speakers who are also going to share from their very different perspectives on what meaningful partnerships can look like, and maybe inspire us to reflect together on what might be some guiding principles going forward so that we can renew this process. So everybody's expressed a deep desire and enthusiasm about renewing this EU-AU partnership process. So how do we do that? And these people today will help us think that through, and with their expertise and experience and stories. So I will begin by perhaps just introducing the speakers. I'll introduce them one by one and let them come in with their interventions. Each speaker will have about 8 minutes. I will try to remind them gently with little tabs. I will make sure that they're visible so that you get gentle encouragement to wrap it up, just because we know that a full morning online like this is quite intense, and we want to make sure to respect people's breaks, and that we stop on time for lunch as planned. So let's just jump right into this really exciting panel. The first person who will speak will be Fatin Agad. She's Senior Advisor to the High Representative of the AU Chairperson on Future Relations with the European Union. And she's previously in different capacities, including as advisor to the African Forum under the leadership of former President Joaquim Chissano, business associate at the Mandeleo Group, and a consultant for multiple United Nations agencies and the African Union Reforms Unit. Also worked with several think tanks in South Africa and Europe, and is a member of the editorial advisory board of the South African Journal of International Affairs, and teaches at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. So welcome. Thank you, Fatin. We'll listen very carefully to your contribution, and then we'll follow up with the other speakers and have some time for questions and discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Josiana, and good morning to everybody, to the panelists, but also to the many of you who are following online. Thanks again for the opportunity to allow us to contribute to the discussion. Well, I wanted to focus my intervention on 4 points. Let me immediately dive into the first one. I think one of the major challenges, and since the question of our panel is what would constitute a genuine and meaningful partnership, I thought that it would be important to start with one important element, which could be seen as one of the major challenges at the moment in terms of the partnership. And that is articulating the value of the partnership strictly in terms of the relations between Africa and Europe, not vis-a-vis any third parties, but what is the core of Europe-Africa relations about? And I think that would be perhaps an important question also in terms of narrative that we keep on hearing, certainly from the African side. What is clear is that in terms of relations between Europe and Africa seen from the African side, there is certainly a great potential, even I think as Ambassador Sakin said it earlier, a clarity in terms of the importance of the relationship for Africa, so the relationship with Europe in its own right. And there's a need to focus our attention and articulate our narrative in terms of what is the future of the partnership about in those terms. And I will, as I proceed, give some examples as to where that value lies. The second question, and the one that I would like to emphasize on, is that we have agreed in 2007 in Lisbon that we will have a paradigm shift. The so-called Beyond Aid debate was triggered. It was a needed discussion simply because of the complexity of the challenges that both Europe and Africa face now. And I think COVID accentuated even some of the pre-existing challenges, that we need to find a new, more complex ways of supporting the partnership. Just early this week, there was a meeting in Paris, for instance, where one of the major challenges, one of the major issues that was discussed is how do we respond to some of the financing challenges that African countries face as a result of COVID. And what is clear, what has been clear certainly from the African side for a long time, is that aid resources alone will not be enough. We've seen a trend, and I always refer to that in many of my my interventions. Since the 1990s, there's been a substantive decline in terms of the percentage of aid in GDP, therefore requiring us to rebalance the partnership and generally development efforts on the African continent with more creative, more innovative ways of responding to those challenges, including in financial terms. So what that means for the partnership with Europe is this even greater urgency to move beyond this aid paradigm and recognize that it's no longer a leverage, so to speak, in the partnership, but an increasingly limited contribution. Now, once we are clear about these broad framing issues in terms of the partnership, I think the other challenges for the partnership to become meaningful is to shift in terms of principles. And there I would like to highlight two key principles. The first is the recognition that we are mutually dependent on one another. The truth is that the partnership has a great potential, if we are able to size it properly, to create what I would call a geographic space of prosperity. A geographic space of prosperity that would benefit people from both continents, but that requires some hard work. On the African side, we've now embarked into a journey, I would call it, of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a very central element in terms of the desire of the African continent to find a new model for its own prosperity, and it would be very important, I think, and I strongly believe that it's a very important opportunity also for our European partners. As I said, we've learned through time that aid alone is not a solution. So and for us, the Continental Free Trade Area is one way of finding new modalities for development on the continent. And so that focus on these new approaches to contribute to the creation of the geographic space of prosperity, as I called it, is very important. The second one that I would like to highlight, and which perhaps is not emphasized enough, is the fact that both regions have something to offer. I think we often forget that when we get too much caught up in what I would call transactional type of relationship between Europe and Africa. It's often about how much money is transferred. But the truth is that we're mutually dependent. The case of peace and security is one of those cases. On the African side, we have stepped up the game, I would say, some time ago, by contributing. Let's not forget, for instance, that if we speak of Somalia in terms of the peace support operations, those are African troops in the field, yes, with substantive and much appreciated financing from the EU. But the boots on the field are also African. So that in itself around us allowed us to find a new way of dealing with the peace and security challenges, respecting the contribution of each one of them: financial on the European side, political and military on the African side. And I think we need to increasingly to even more and more emphasize on some of these points. Just to conclude, a couple of points that I also wanted to refer to. We often speak of what can the partnership look at, what should be collaborating on, peace and security, climate change, etc. And I think what we need to talk more about is the process through which we are doing that. And the question is, are we doing enough of that? A process in terms of dialogue, in terms of solid, real dialogue, as for instance now, as we move towards the summit, it's not an instrumental dialogue just to go through the tick box of the programming process, but real dialogue to understand, as I said earlier, what is the core of the partnership about. And what we need, and we are, I would say, far enough, and that's my last, far from that point, that's my last point, we will need to align our ambitions to realities. I think the Secretary of State earlier mentioned the point of the need to implement the partnership effectively. And I would agree with that. I think there's a need to look at how we will implement the partnership effectively. And to do that, we need to move beyond the talk and actually walk the talk. And that would require a mainstreaming, I would say, of the dialogues that we are conducting, of the financing mechanisms that we are using, bringing together contributions of both, as I said earlier, on peace and security. The other dimension on the African side is that we have put into place an African peace facility. How can we bring that with the European financing mechanisms to be able to contribute and truly move on this road of a joint partnership? Rome was not built in a day, and neither will the partnership between Europe and Africa. I think what's required is hard work and commitment to really move towards this paradigm shift. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fatin, for starting us off on this really interesting debate. I heard a few key words there that I think will come back probably in the questions. And I heard about the value of the relationship of the narrative and walking the talk. So moving from the narrative to action. So these are probably some arrows where we'll follow in the discussion afterwards. And with that, also a discussion on the process on how we establish that dialogue. So thank you very much for that, for starting us off. And I would invite our second speaker to begin. Is going to be Luis Leandro da Silva. He's the director of the Department for Sub-Saharan Africa at the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs since September 2018. Prior to joining this department, he also worked in the Department of Multilateral Affairs and International Political Organizations. He was deputy head of mission at the Portuguese embassies in Warsaw, and Zagreb, and Luanda, and was head of division for European security and defense policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2006 to 2010. He's also served as a political advisor at the Embassy of Portugal in Washington, D.C. from 2010 to 2015. So thank you very much, Mr. da Silva, and you have also 8 minutes to start off, so please.
Thank you very much, Josiane, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers for this invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this very interesting conference and panel. I'll also speak in English, I think, just to facilitate the flow of the discussion. And what I would like to do in my intervention is to focus a little bit on the angle of how Portuguese diplomacy and Portuguese foreign policy views this topic of the EU-AU relations, and also to be in line with what you requested, Josiane, what we think needs to be done for us to reach a genuine and meaningful partnership, to paraphrase, I think, the title of of the panel, which is a happy expression. And to start, I would say that promoting the EU relations has always been really a top foreign policy priority for Portugal, and one in which we have over time, and I think in a consistent way, invested a lot of political and diplomatic capital. And without false modesty, I think we managed to achieve some results in that. And perhaps it's not by chance that it was during the first two EU-Africa summits took place during Portuguese presidencies of the European Union, the first one in Cairo in 2000 and the second one in Lisbon in 2007, in which we approved, as was already mentioned by other speakers, the so-called joint EU-Africa strategy, which is a document that still holds today. So we've always been advocating both for the need of a very high-level political dialogue between the two continents, but that this dialogue has to be accompanied by substantive and concrete results. That's a fundamental point for us. And the reason we've been doing this just from the beginning of when we joined the EU is that I think we recognized or we understood from quite early on that Africa, as Europe's closest and most immediate neighbor, is really a fundamental partner if Europe wants to be a geopolitical player in the world and have increasing influence on global issues. And I think the importance of Africa is today even more clear than in the past. I think we all know Africa has great demographic strength. It represents today 1/6 of the world population. In 30 years' time, which is quite soon, it will be 1/4 of the world population, and estimates are that by the end of the century, 1/3 of mankind will be in Africa. Africa is also a huge multilateral force. It represents 1/4 of the membership of the UN, and it's also undergoing a very rapid process of urbanization. According to to some statistics, the top 15 cities most likely to grow in the world in the next 15 years will all be in Africa. And Africa is also a very strong continent in what relates to digital penetration, mobile telephones penetration, and this is, I think, also because very much of its young population. So I think this combination of rapid demographic growth, rapid urbanization, a youthful population that's very digitally attuned, means that many of the future consumers of the world in the coming years will be found in Africa, and that Africa will be inevitably a very important center of world economic activity. And we have no doubts that this will happen. And the title of your conference also mentions that we're debating the issue of Africa-EU relations in an increasingly complex world, which I think rightly points out to the fact that many other major world actors like China, Russia, India, Turkey, and the Gulf countries have also grasped very well the importance of Africa and the increasing role that they are playing on the world stage. And I think another element by which we can see this growing rise of Africa from a geostrategic point of view is the fact that so many of these countries are holding bilateral high-level summits with Africa. And also, if we look at the number of foreign embassies that have been opened in Africa in the last 15 years, the number is really impressive, something around 320 embassies have been opened during that period. So the environment, the international environment regarding Africa is really one of very great competition, which is something that we should view as normal, but that, of course, I think we have to be on our tiptoes. Europe, if we want to be a primary partner of this continent. On what we think should be done to ensure that the partnership really becomes one that's very meaningful and genuine. The first is what has been said by other speakers, is we have to completely abandon this old paradigm of the donor recipient relationship. I think we need more trade, not aid. We need to bring more investments to Africa instead of focusing predominantly on exports. We need more private sector activity that can help create the necessary jobs for Africa's growing young population. And this project of the African Continental Free Trade Area is absolutely key in that aspect. It's key for, I think, African industrialization. And I think Europe is very well positioned, let's say, to support Africa in operationalizing the African Continental Free Trade Area. And for the future, we have to think about linking the EU common market with this new, very ambitious project. This is a very, I think, important political vision for the future. Secondly, we need to focus very much on everything that has to do with recovering from COVID. This is both in the health dimension, and here we need to do much more to bring more vaccines to Africa. We need to do more to increase African production capacity of health products and vaccines, and also everything that has to do with, let's say, social economic recovery. We need to go beyond debt relief, and we need to try to ensure greater financial access for African economies, and also mobilizing more investments for the future. A third commitment has to do with the newer priorities that have been mentioned by, which are the green growth and the digital transformation. And I think we also, in a way, need to go back to basics. We need to do more on human development, meaning health and education. These are fundamentals for societies to thrive. And so we need to combine both this future outlook with the green and the digital, but without forgetting the basics of education and health. I just want to say a quick word on on our current EU presidency, where we have once again tried to do to highlight Africa as much as possible internationally. The Secretary of State already mentioned the very big event we organized on the green in economic investment forum. But just yesterday, the EU ministers of foreign affairs met in Lisbon for their Gimnish meeting, and the topic of EU-Africa relations was on the agenda. That was the first topic. Today, the EU ministers of defense are meeting also in Lisbon with the African counterparts of the regional economic communities, the so-called RECs, to discuss issues of peace and governance. And we've organized just a plethora of multiple events, from science to education to space issues. It's, I think, a very complete program. As you know, we've always also been mobilizing EU support to help Mozambique face the challenges of terrorism in Cabo Delgado. We've organized also a meeting of special representatives of the EU for the Sahel. So Africa is really a top priority for us, and it will remain so in the future. I apologize if I exceeded the 8 minutes by a little bit, but then I'll be open to any questions that the panel may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Silva. You only went over by a minute and a half or something, so you were quite good. Thank you for your very energetic sharing of ideas and thoughts. And I think that what we heard here will stimulate a lot of discussion, because you named a number of reasons why people should pay attention to Africa, but clearly also that there's competing interests for why and how to engage in that relationship. So it'll be interesting to hear how we ensure some kind of harmony in the policies, right? So next speaker will be Tanya Cox. And she's been working in civil society for almost 20 years, leading work on human rights, sustainable development, and inequalities. She's been the director of Concord, the European network of NGOs, working on development and international cooperation for the last 2 years, where she is focused on strengthening civil society so it can play its vital role vis-a-vis EU institutions and European governments. She's also guiding the Confederation to take a more systemic approach to its work, questioning imbalances of power and wealth across the world. Before joining civil society, Tanya also worked in the private sector in a number of different countries. So Tanya, we're very eager to hear your perspectives.
Thank you so much, Josiane, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's been really interesting conversations so far, and I'm sure that some of the things I'm going to say will echo what we've already been hearing. One of the great things about the COVID-19 period, because there aren't that many, let's face it, but one of the great things about the COVID-19 period is, and this business of going digital, is that you can join conversations from all around the world. It has really erased the geographic barriers from that perspective. And so I've been really fortunate in being able to listen to civil society and to activists from Africa, and to be able to learn a lot from them as well. And I think I have to take this into consideration when I'm going to be talking about EU and Africa relations, and what a genuine partnership between the two continents might look like, because otherwise, what is the point of listening? And a number of the other speakers have talked about this importance of listening to each other. So from listening to colleagues around the world, I've heard the civil society voices in Africa, they've said they want to be self-sufficient and independent. They want Africa not to rely on EU aid, or any aid from any other country for that matter. They know full well that Africa is a rich continent that actually has all the resources it needs to be independent. But that at the moment, it's not the case in practice. And they talk about debt as being the new form of slavery in Africa. And they're fed up, frankly, with Africa taking loans to pay off loans. And they speak of losing one set of colonizers only to pass via sometimes some relatively corrupt governments to end up being colonized by others, the Chinese. And they're painfully aware of the new scramble for Africa. And we've talked about this quite a lot within Concord and in different debates. But they're really worried that in this new scramble for Africa, Africans themselves, the people, risk losing out again. And they don't feel that they can trust either their governments to do the right thing or Western powers, because let's face it, they do clearly just want to make money. And if I think about these things that I've heard, and then I reflect on the EU-Africa relationship, I can see that EU is caught somewhere in the middle of this scramble. Because yes, it does want to, be able to meet its economic interests, let's put it that way, but it also has values. And I really do think that it genuinely wants to be able to support Africa to meet the needs of its people, to be able to meet people's rights and fulfill people's rights. And we're definitely, in the last 18 months, hearing a new narrative from EU leaders. I mean, I've been hearing talk of moving from a transactional to a transformational relationship. I even heard this year the word co-creation, and I was really happy about this. Now, I think that we have to recognize that the EU does at the same time want to meet its economic interests and sees Africa as a land of opportunity. So is it possible to reconcile these two? A transformational relationship means that you design the agenda and the goals together. You jointly work to achieve them. And at least from my perspective, something that's extremely important would be that you would be willing to forego short-term gain for the longer term goals and trust that this would be building, you know, the inclusivity, the sustainability, and that would be what would make a partnership. And I think this echoes slightly what Faten was talking about, because this is the difference between having a relationship between the two continents and building a partnership between the two continents. And if you want to move to a partnership, you need to understand what you want the partnership for. And there I really do agree with what Faten was saying. What will take it beyond a simple relationship, like a trading relationship or a security relationship or a political relationship, to create that partnership? Partnerships between countries, I assume, are probably pretty like partnerships between people. And that you, apart from having these common goals, you also need some key ingredients to make it work. And I'd like to suggest a few that I think at least could be important in the EU-Africa relationship. And the first is honesty. I think that EU and African nations should sit together and review the policies and the practices that have caused inequalities and injustices to develop between the two continents. And I think that they need to find ways to address them head on, honestly. And yes, this means that Europe is going to have to address its colonial past. I think the second thing that's particularly important is to make a genuine effort to rebalance the power. I mean, EU talks about building an equal and fair partnership. But Africa and Europe are actually not really very equal at the moment. And I think thought needs to be given to how to rebalance the power relationship between the two, so that one can move forward on an equal and fair footing, so as to create, at the very least, a meaningful partnership. And I think both of these ingredients would then help build a third one, which is important, and that's trust. Trust is key in a partnership. And then the fourth one that I would like to add is humility. The humility to listen to each other. And here I'd like to bring the example of the EU-Africa Summit. And we know it's been postponed now a number of times for a number of reasons, all very good, valid reasons. But there is nothing preventing us starting to consult each other on what this summit could be about, on what this summit could be resulting in. My proposal for a long time, and in Concord we've been saying, EU, please consult already with the African governments what they would like the summit to be on, so that we can build a meaningful summit, a meaningful agenda, and co-create that agenda. But that also means consulting with people. And we've been pushing like mad to have this consultation, and to my knowledge this hasn't yet started. We very much welcome, the support of the EU officials who say they're willing to do it, but I don't think it's started. And unless we actually talk to people, we're not going to know what's important for people. And that is what the summit needs to be about. Now, we very much welcome and encourage the Portuguese to please continue your support for this. You've been, extremely supportive and helpful so far, and we would very much, hope that you would continue this after your presidency is over, and maybe contribute to this fair and equal partnership that we want. So if I now turn to the fair part of things, there's a whole lot of things that the EU could do, and some people have been touching on them. Debt is now a really big issue. I mean, in Africa, the issue of liquidity and fiscal space in order to respond to the COVID-19 crisis is paramount. And we all know that African nations have a lot of debt. I mean, billions of dollars of debt. And we also know that half of the loans that they take on are just to pay off the debt interest. So we need more than just debt rescheduling. Now, the EU is again supportive here. I've heard Commissioner Urpilainen talking, and she sounds very supportive, but we need to be a lot more radical. And I don't think we should be waiting for others before we make the first move. Debt stops governments from investing in quality public services. Those quality public services are critical both to responding to the COVID-19, but also for this social contract, which is absolutely needed anywhere between any people and their government. The second thing would be sorry, I was going to use an abbreviation. Domestic resource mobilization. Domestic resource mobilization, like sorting out the debt issue, is key to being able to provide quality public services for people, but it's also important for innovation, for investing in infrastructure, energy, to be able to respond to climate change. All of these things, one needs to have the means, the financial resources, and Fatima was talking about this as well. And I agree with what she said. According to UNCTAD, Africa could gain almost $89 billion a year just by tackling illicit capital flight. And this is something that I think that the EU could support Africa with. It's almost twice the amount of ODA that Africa receives. It's a phenomenal amount of money. So at the very least, Europe needs to make sure that European companies pay taxes in their country of operation and ensures public country by country reporting, which is what we've been calling for now for a long time. Thank you, Josiane. Others have talked about trade, so I won't go into this, but I don't think that the current trade relationships between the EU and Africa are altogether favorable or even fair. So perhaps that needs to be looked at. And that brings me on to something which is a little bit geeky and policy-like, but policy coherence for sustainable development. This is something that we think the EU needs to do a lot more on to make sure that it doesn't give with one hand and take with the other, so that its policies don't undermine what it's trying to do in, for example, development cooperation. And here we can think of, again, trade policies, but also migration policies, security policies, and you name it. And then lastly, and I'm sure that we'll come back to this, I think the EU needs to do a lot more on sharing technology and know-how and making and working with companies to make sure this is possible. I respect IPR, of course, sorry, intellectual property rights, of course I do. But I mean, if we just look at the vaccines fiasco, I mean, honestly, it's shameful. And Europe should have been pushing a TRIPS waiver in the WTO right from the beginning to enable Africa to produce vaccines as well. Other countries don't want Europe's leftovers. And I think that needs to be a very powerful message that European governments need to take away. All in all, in my opinion, I think there's quite a lot we need to do to be able to create these equal and fair partnerships. There's a long road ahead, but I do think we're hearing a lot more that's working sort of in the direction of at least the willingness to create these partnerships. And so, of course, we would very much like to support that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And you took us in many directions, which I hope we can explore in the conversation afterwards. I just want to make sure there is time for that conversation and that we hear from Moses, who's our next and last speaker before we go into the questions. But I really do want to thank you for exploring also how the content can shift based on who's in the conversation. And that's a very valuable element to add to these processes of partnership, who you partner with and how you partner the process, but also what you discuss changes based on who's in the room. So that's a very important point to add. So thank you, and we'll get back to you for questions in just a few minutes after we've heard from Moses Isuba, who's the Executive Director of Uganda National NGO Forum, a sharing and reflection platform for NGOs in Uganda, influencing and contributing to the development and governance processes. So prior to joining the NGO Forum, Moses was working as a governance expert with Action Aid International, a global federation of members and country programs working in 46 countries to achieve social justice, gender equality, and poverty eradication. Previously, he was a program coordinator of the civil and political rights component of Danida Human Rights and Good Governance program in Uganda. He has over 25 years of continuous experience in development work. And currently Moses is a member of Reimagining INGOs, Ringo, Social Lab, which is a group of practitioners and activists challenging the INGO industrial complex through disruption, innovation, and systematic thinking. So we're very eager to hear you, Moses, to complete this round of panelists, and then we can start a discussion. So 8 minutes as well for you, please.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and privilege to be part of the panel. And I'm glad that I'm speaking after Tanya. I think Tanya and I are kind of like reading from the same text. But let me start from a point of the conversation here is for us to reimagine, what would constitute a meaningful and equal partnership. And I think the first point that I really want to underscore here is the language. Because when we talk about partnership, and then we are talking about how can we think of equal partnership, we premise this on the assumption that we've actually had partnership in the last couple of years, which actually could be wrong. That what we've actually had in the last couple of years in terms of the relationship between the EU and Africa hasn't been partnership, but has actually been a funding relationship where there is financial flow from the European Union to the African countries. It has been a funding relationship which has been constructed on control and mistrust. And I think that's why Tanya really mentioned the point of truthfulness and the point of honesty. What we've actually had is the funding relationship, which has been crafted, as I said, on control and mistrust. And that in itself as an issue that we need to be interrogated if we are going to be talking of how do we construct partnerships. And if we want to talk about partnerships, then the other important question that we need to be asking ourselves, on whose terms are we talking about these partnerships? And who is benefiting from this partnership? So the whole concept of the language, the narrative that we use is actually very important in terms of shaping the kind of relationship, the kind of partnership that we do have. Oftentimes we hear, whether it's the European Union or our leaders when they meet at the African Union, we hear about Africa is rising. And while that could be true that Africa is rising, we are concerned that it's not about the continent, but should be about the people. It's not about Africa is rising as a continent, because that continues to exist, that, we hear romantic economists telling us, Kenya is developing by 70%, Uganda is developing by so and so percent. But the social indicators of our people continue to be depressingly poor. So it should not be about Africa is rising, but Africans rising. And this is what we would like to see, the people rising and not just the continent rising. And I think previous panelists, and I was really taken back by what Ambassador Da Silva said. He said one of the things that he would like to do is to bring vaccines to Africa. And we are saying, no, do not bring vaccines to Africa. As Tanya said, we are not interested in the leftovers of what you have actually used. What we are interested right now is patent waivers, being able to do technology transfers to Africa and perhaps capacity building. Many of our countries are able to do vaccine production. But we cannot talk about partnership if Europe is interested in the health of its citizens, but not interested in the health of the Africans. So what is going to happen is that, the whole of Europe is going to achieve perhaps 100% vaccine cover, and then, Africa will be under less than 5%. And, the worst of people that you would like to have in your partnership are people who are either sick or dead. So I think it's very important that, we do not talk about bringing vaccines to Africa, but we talk about the transfer of technology, the capacity building to do vaccine production. We talk about, the patent waivers, because the big pharma that are producing the vaccines are in the north. And it is an embarrassing situation right now to be in this conference talking about equal partnerships when we know many of the countries in Africa were not yet even at a 5% vaccine cover. And then further speaking on the issue of language, what has actually happened right now in the past, or maybe in the past couple of years, is that trade and development have been fused. And so what we see in many of the European missions here is that the heads of missions carry two hats. There is a hat on one side of trade, and on the other side, there is a hat of development. So it is always good that we hear this rhetoric that, oh, what Africa needs is trade. That's perfect. That's what we need is trade. But the greatest challenge that we do have now is that the heart of trade seems to be shadowing the heart of development. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon the European nations to be able to see how they can balance that power, how they can actually balance the trade heart and the development heart. And so as we're having this conversation at a time when, first of all, we have a public health emergency, but also because China has been quite out there trying to get space. And so one of the questions that we need to be asking is, are we having this as a genuine conversation, or the European Union is having this conversation because China is taking up its space? Are we having this conversation because there is a realization from the European Union that the time is now for change? So, as I say, there are only three options to the European-Africa relations. Either you transform now, or you die well, or you die badly. So those seem to be like the three things on the table in terms of how we can move with this relationship. And, and for us to be able to construct this partnership, I think it's going to be important to step back and take a historical perspective of this, what has led to the systemic and structural causes of this unequal relationship. What has led, what are the systemic and structural causes of what we know is failing this partnership? And I think that's going to be very important, that as the European Union relates with governments and relates with the civil society, it's going to be important, to be able to dig out the root cause there. Let me just speak to the point of not long ago, again, we had the Germans coming up with the Marshall Plan for Africa. Again, when we hear that kind of language of Marshall Plan for Africa, it kind of like takes us back to the colonial history. And we think we are looking, it's as if the European Union is still looking at Africa to establish colonial outposts. And I think this is one other thing that needs to be changing, the kind of language, the kind of narrative that you use. And perhaps it may be good to end with a point in terms of the quality and volume of aid. Because what we're seeing that there is a relationship between the EU, our governments, and the civil society. And what we often see is that there is quite a higher volume of support, financial support, that goes to the governments. And there's very limited volume of support that goes to civil society. And then what we hear is, oh, we need a civil society to hold the governments accountable. You cannot arm our governments with rifles and then arm us with bread knives and then assuming that we can actually be able to hold our governments accountable. That becomes quite a problem in itself. So when we are looking at establishing the partnership, I think it's going to be very important that we move away from a funding relationship to actual partnership. And I think Tanya outlined some of the key ingredients of what would constitute a genuine partnership, where we need to make a conscious and deliberate effort to move away from control and mistrust to trust and coaching, so that we can actually be able to address ourselves as partners, as equals. And this is going to take time. It's not something that we can actually pretend for a moment that Africa right now and Europe right now are partners, are equals. I mean, we as countries, we of course, we are sovereign states. yeah, that's fine, we are sovereign states, but some of the budgets of maybe universities in Europe could be the budget of some of our countries. So we couldn't really say that we are partners that are equal. But I think we need to be strategically moving into that direction and being able to find out what is it in terms of structure and systemically, what is it that brought us to where we are right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Moses, for adding on to that and following so nicely after Tanya's presentation as well, really questioning the genuineness and the meaningfulness of the partnership and not just the maybe quantitative quality of it. So I think that's a very useful path to follow to really reflect on partnership and the nature of it and the process by which we develop it. So now we have time for some questions before we have about 40 minutes for questions before we break for lunch. While we have 1 or 2 questions that have come in, you can put them in the Q&A box and we will collect them and try to distribute them to the speakers. I do have a few questions that had been prepared ahead, so I'll go ahead and start with those to stimulate, and then I'll go to the 2 questions that are waiting, and if there's any others, then you'll have a chance to think about it, maybe, and react. And of course, I will be interested in the speakers, the panelists, maybe reacting to each other if they would like, maybe to take a moment to think about that if they have questions for each other. That would probably be really interesting to know as well. So perhaps start with a question for Faten. You mentioned the narrative moving into action, and you began to talk about how that would happen. I think we'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Perhaps you spoke about the finance side of things. You talked about the walking the talk. So how would we transform this narrative into actual reality, and what are some of the challenges right now that you see in your assessment of that?
Thank you, Josiana. I mean, to me, I'd highlight 2 points. The first one is who are we talking to? I think you said it yourself earlier. Those to whom you talk define what message you are referring to. I think that's missing. I think there's somehow some of us have gotten into the bad habit of finding other people to talk to, you know, more to move quickly because there's a deadline, rather than really taking time to understand and have a meaningful discussion. So I think for us to be able to truly have that paradigm shift, we need to have the courage to actually take the time to listen, help co-create, I think, as Tanya said. And that co-creation requires us to be very conscious in terms of who do we bring around the table, how do we set priorities. I think we still see some initiatives emerging with very selective process of consultations, rather than, you know, we're still, and I always say it, we're still in the realm of international relations. That realm of international relations requires also a process of dialogue among the actors that will eventually sign up to these things. It will require a certain ownership of whatever will come out. I mean, let's take the African side. It's not a couple of individuals that you need to get into some high-level panels. There's a system, there are states, there are people, there's civil society, there's a system of accountability there vis-a-vis their states, their parliaments. And so all of those need to be taken into account. I think high-level panels have a value in helping to unpack some of these issues. But again, I think we need to go back to the process that should not replace what international partnerships is again about. So that is a proper process of inclusive consultations. The second one, and I think Tanya alluded to it in a different way when she spoke of policy coherence, but let me bring it again to the current situation that we find ourselves in terms of EU-Africa relations. Let me take the case of migration, for instance. There is we still need, I think, for that paradigm shift and truly to be able to recognize the value that Africa also brings to the table. I think that we are yet to strike the balance in terms of this obsession, I would say, on returns and readmission. With a free movement of people. I think we remain very far from a real true discussion in terms of mobility of Africans, just like we discuss mobility of other nationals from around the world. There's a strong focus on Africa, but we forget that in terms of percentage of migratory flow to Europe, Africans are by far not the predominant group. A lot of, in fact, the predominant group is, coming from the East or other developed nation. And yet we have here a hungry youth population in Africa to whom migration is about meeting their aspirations. Many of them are also returning to the continent, bringing knowledge, bringing networks, which are increasingly important in our modern world. And so we need to find a space to actually genuinely have that discussion. So we've been talking about supporting illegal migratory routes, but concretely speaking, we haven't moved. We haven't even started a proper dialogue because there is this strong obsession on due to domestic pressure. I mean, we're aware of that, but due to this obsession with readmission, returns and readmission. So dialogue, and then perhaps the last point is realigning. We spoke of financial tools. There's at the moment this whole discussion on the implementation of the NDICI. And the question, and I follow that discussion very, very closely, I mean, including to the level of the parliamentary discussions. The question is, where is the space of the EU-Africa or the Europe-Africa, as I prefer to talk about it, the Europe-Africa partnership in that entire constellation? It's unfortunately not clear. And so the risk is that we will end up retroactively, so to speak, then trying to scramble and find some space of how do we concretely implement the partnership or whatever outcome that we will have from the summit. So clarity in that sense and the ability to link ambition in terms of strategy, in terms of summit, to the means of implementation, if I can call it in SDG terms, is an important discussion. I think that's yet to be had, or at least some clarity on that to be given.
Thank you so much. I have another question here for Mr. Da Silva. You mentioned a number of priorities and interests that are, and some of them are a little bit, as we said, a little bit in competition with each other about, whether it's trade and sustainability, whether it's mobility and it's security. I mean, so how do you see this? What are some of the challenges that you've seen in this presidency, and what do you think are going to be the main challenges going forward to try to put them in a certain order of value that can be shared between both continents?
Thank you, Josiane. And first of all, let me say that I've found interventions by both Fat and Tanya and Moses extremely interesting. I think the points that Tanya mentioned about honesty, trust, fairness, humility are extremely significant. We need to bring this much more and more into the partnership. That means we need to listen much more to each other. And we've always been saying to even to our European friends that it's fundamental that we listen to the Africans, what their priorities are, so we can really merge them and that they can be really joint common priorities. This is fundamental, and this brings me to the point that you raised. I think we have quite a lot of agreement on the main themes that should form, let's say, the bulk of the substance of the next summit. Maybe the European side places a little bit more emphasis on the newer priorities, such as the green transition and the digital. The African side more focused at this moment on the issue of economic recovery and health recovery from COVID, which is, but that we recognize that is fundamental. And I want to agree also with the point of Moses that it's not sufficient, of course, for us only to bring more vaccines to Africa. We need, of course, to do more transfer of technology and to build African capacities for vaccine production and for production of health projects. And we've been quite supportive of that, and we hope that will be there will be a program also in the months to come and in the run-up to the summit for that. But there's then a lot of common ground. I think peace and security and governance we view as fundamental issues. The points on multilateralism, everything that has to do with, let's say, investment and trade. There are common perspectives, and then a point mentioned by Fatin, the issue of migration and mobility. Of course, there are some different perspectives on between both blocks, but the Portuguese point of view is that we really have to find a balanced approach to this, meaning that the mobility side is extremely important also, and we need to do much more on that through, for example, programs like Erasmus Plus. I think we need to do a boost of Erasmus Plus to have a much greater interchange between the youth of both continents, and that is something that Portugal is actually quite strong on, and on, let's say, what we call the dimension of people-to-people contacts, which we think is fundamental for the EU-African relation, I think, and a strong point. We have that, let's say, at a national point of view, because we have very large numbers of Portuguese citizens living in African countries, around 4% of our population, and also significant African communities here in Portugal. And this is one of the very, our relations with Africa transcend the relations between, the political relations just between governments, the relations really between people to people, between entrepreneurs to entrepreneurs, between scientists to scientists. And this is I think, the pillar of mobility that we need to increase very much. But as I said, I'm quite optimistic that we are on a good track, and that there is not, I wouldn't say, of course, full convergence of these priorities and on all the themes, but that we have we've had a substantive exchange, and I think this, in a way, the dialogue has in a way been interrupted by COVID.
How to engage civil society in Africa in a meaningful way, because part of the issue of the partnership between the institutions and this process is how do you ensure that these voices of communities and their interests and their preferences for what life should look like, or what they believe are the priorities for their flourishing, be put on the agenda? And how do we ensure that? How do the consultation processes look? How could they look? Which would enhance, in the end, the partnership between the two continents and the peoples in those two continents. And I really appreciated that remark that came up just by I think it was Mr. De Silva who said it's about people. It's not about just institutions, and it's not just about governments, and it's not just about commissions and parliaments. It's about real people's lives that we're talking here. So is there space for that process of consultation to be rethought, which would strengthen the partnership? And I don't know who would like to come in on this, but I think it was a question that was coming up in different areas there.
Let me offer to jump in here. I think what could actually be able to trigger not only civil society participation, I think is to rethink the engagement and be truthful to the subsidiarity principle. Here, this is the principle that those closest to the problem usually have the solutions. And I think, when we are getting people that are coming from the north, coming down to Africa, whether it's engaging government to government or engaging citizens or civil society, it's very important that we do acknowledge that. That the subsidiarity principle, that those closer to the problem would usually have the solutions. And so what that means is that our colleagues from the north would have to immunize themselves against the disease of power and privilege, which often goes ahead of them. Because what we see is that when we are having these conversations of equal partnerships, usually the power and privilege goes ahead, and that in a way skews the conversation, skews the participation. And so that could be very something that needs to be addressed. But now that I have, let me just use maybe half a minute to just say one or other thing. That I think as the EU tries to touch the reset button in terms of how this partnership relations can be configured, I think you need to remain acutely aware that the ghost of Donald Trump is alive and well in Europe. And what we are having now, increasingly, we are seeing a rise of nationalist, inward-looking leaders that are actually coming into Europe. And these would be leaders that would be, as I said, inward nationalists. They would be looking and trying to redefine development. So I think that's an important thing. So even when we talk about technology transfer for vaccine production, patent waivers, how are these nationalist leaders, are they ready to be able to do that technology transfer? Or they would actually rather promote what, for lack of a better word, we are calling the vaccine apartheid. So I think it is important to consider that. Then the final bit here is for me that for a long time, we've actually looked as aid as it is working. But I think it is truth to be told that there have been challenges of aid. And in 1992, in the Development Dictionary, I think Wolfgang Sachs did say that the future of aid was actually failing, and it was a ruin in the intellectual landscape. And that hasn't changed even now. So what we are seeing and what needs to be is that the aid industrial complex needs to be changed, because it is premised on vested interests. It is premised on there is not neutrality. And what we actually think right now is another scramble for Africa, where the Portuguese would want to take a big portion, whatever others would want to take a big portion, the Chinese are scrambling. So I think that this whole industrial complex needs to be rethought, and the conversation needs to be reinterrogated if we are going to be engaging in these meaningful and equal partnerships.
Thank you, Moses. Tanya, could I invite you maybe to follow up and add something to that? Also, there's a question in the chat, which I don't know if you've seen, which I'll add to the reflection. It says, dear Tanya and Moses, thank you for your powerful speeches. Can you say more about the ways that you could move beyond economic investment and commit to human development efforts like improving healthcare access to education and social protection, among many of the other elements that you already raised?
Thank you very much, Josiane. I'll do my best to try and fit these two in. maybe I can talk from a personal Concord perspective. Of course, this doesn't necessarily apply beyond Concord, but what we've been trying to do recently is to reach out much more to people that we don't normally speak to, and to make sure that when we're talking, sometimes on behalf of other people, let's face it, that we actually are reflecting what they would like us to be saying. So when we do our advocacy around, say, the EU-Africa Summit, when we write our statements around, say, the post-Cotonou agreement, and we've recently emitted a statement, we try to reflect what we're hearing from our African colleagues as well. And one of the things that we've been hearing is a very clear demand to be putting local civil society and local NGOs in the driving seat. And this is completely natural, and it's the right order of things. And this is indeed what we would like to be doing more and more, and what we would be urging the EU to do more and more. And creating the spaces and reaching out nonetheless to the huge variety and diversity of local civil society, this takes time. And I think sometimes the European Union has its schedules and its timetables, and things have to be completed by a certain date. And, you know, we all feel that the world will fall apart if we don't meet that deadline. And that does hamper true consultation, especially if you don't start in time, given that we know these things are coming up and they have their deadlines. So that's perhaps another thing to bear in mind. Start the consultations in time. And then we need to listen to what the people actually say. And indeed, and this speaks to the other question that came in, people are talking about human development. They're talking about the healthcare. They're talking about education. They're worried about their livelihoods. Even in countries in Africa where the health impacts of the COVID-19 crisis may not have been so dire, the livelihoods impacts have been enormous. And so these are what people are talking about and what people would like put on the agenda. And so when I then hear, as I quite regularly do, the EU to say, well, we've got our 5 priorities, and therefore we're going to have to see, well, how do we juggle this, and how would we maybe fit some human development in? My response is, well, no, we're not just trying to, it's great to mainstream it in current 5 priorities, but that's not enough. If people are asking us to look at their livelihoods and to see how we can make sure we have sustainable livelihoods for all, if people are asking us to look and see how we can support with human development, then that's what we need to do, and we need to do it in its own right, not just fitting it in where it suits us on the digitalization and all the other priorities we may already have set. So I think there's this element of flexibility as well that needs to be introduced in order to really have a meaningful and genuine partnership.
Thank you, Tanya. I know these are very packed questions, and people have a lot of content in them. There's sort of a follow-up question here that I see, which I caught earlier from Our Land is Our Life platform, so a Pan-African platform of faith actors and CSO social movements who are trying to bring forward the voices of local communities to conserve their land for food production. So we spoke about food being an issue and land being an issue, and also protect the environment and natural resources, also priorities of the EU, of course. So the question in a sense is, listening, you know, to the underlying value of listening and the consultation, as we said, of local communities and actors. How could an organization or movement such as this one, for example, make their inputs into a process? I mean, this is a concrete example of one movement that would like to see a space opened up where they could bring in, they represent a great number of voices, as I understand it. So how would they contribute, for example, their concerns to the 4th EU Africa Agricultural Ministers Conference example, and they give that example for June 22nd. So maybe there's sort of a response here. There's a concrete example of somebody saying, here we've got input, where could we put it, you know, so that we get heard as well, and we can feed into the priorities discussions. I don't know who would like to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, Josiana. Yeah, it's indeed a very important question. I think where do civil societies then find the entry points? From the, particularly on the agricultural side of things, on the African side, the 2, if I can put it that way, institutional entry points for civil society to engage with. One is through the AU Development Agency, or it used to be called NEPAD for those more familiar with the wording, that does organize quite regularly consultations also with non-state actors across the continent, including, and I mentioned agriculture particularly because they've invested quite a bit on it. So that would be one entry point, also because of the policy dimension that they're involved in. The other one is obviously at the level of the AU Commission itself. There are several Pan-African platforms of civil society organizations that are organized around the AU Commission. Quite a number of them are actually based in Addis. So perhaps I think the recommendation here would be for the organization maybe to get in contact with some of the Addis-based platforms for civil society organizations, because some of them eventually do have an input into the preparatory civil society, EU-AU civil society meeting ahead of the summit, which is a regularly scheduled meeting. So, so with that perspective, a link to the African civil society groups engaged in that process.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody else want to comment on any other interventions that have happened so far before I move to another question?
Josiane, I don't know whether the ambassador is still with us, but that could be a question for him as well. I was just looking in the participants list and I think he might have fallen out and not been able to rejoin. But just to suggest to the organization concerned that perhaps you could always write to him as well and mention today's conversation. Do direct advocacy like that.
Thank you, Tanya. So at least, I mean, the question is there, so I think it's an interesting one for reflection, and we'll move on to. Oh, sorry, Mr. De Silva, did you want to?
On the EU side, Josiane, I think a door, of course, to knock on would be the commissioner, the EU Commissioner for Agricultural, and also the European External Action Service through the, let's say, MD Africa. I think those are they would be the most normal entry points for this contact on the EU side.
All right, thank you. There is a question here about the pandemic that has caused major changes in governance strategies all over the world. And the US $1 trillion plan to support its economy is a good example. Are we moving beyond the neoliberal paradigm? We spoke about this paradigm shift. And if so, what implications could there be for Africa-EU relations, especially taking into account that most of the EU language on the reshaping of the partnership was defined before the pandemic? So how has the pandemic affected maybe this narrative now? Who feels compelled to respond? Maybe Mr. De Silva wants to start us off, and then others can follow suit.
Sorry. I think COVID-19, like any other pandemic, is a pathological intersection of social, political, and economic processes. And I think what it has actually done, it has done us a ghastly favor of things that we knew but we never paid attention to. It has actually exposed the inequality, and right now the non-pharmaceutical interventions, whether it is social distancing, wearing a mask, or washing your hands, are things that are not possible in informal settlements. These are like seen for people that are in a certain wealth bracket. And right now, many countries, either in Europe or the US, have been sending millions of dollars as part of a package to enable the countries, especially in the South, to rebuild their health infrastructure. And I think when all this is really done, and I hope that we can all get vaccinated, and then we put this pandemic behind, I think the EU is going to have to rethink in terms of how it can invest to improve the health infrastructure, how it can invest, for instance, to improve the water reticulation system, because we can't be talking about people to wash hands when people don't even have where to wash hands. And so I think this is going to be something that, in terms of infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure do we need in the countries, as opposed to some, white elephant type of infrastructure? Of course, we need a railway line for transporting. We need some high-rise buildings, but I think it's going to require a sort of a rethink in terms of what kind of infrastructure that can be invested in. And also what is going to require is the rethinking in terms of how the European Union and African countries can engage in terms of improving governance. Because actually what has happened is that the COVID-19 pandemic has been misused in terms of rolling back on fundamental freedoms, and also, in terms of, the rule of law. So that's why I said that this whole pandemic has done us different favors. And I think it means that in terms of engagement, the European Union would have to see how best can we engage with the countries to work on their social dimension, the economic dimension, and the political dimension. I think that's why there was an important question of how can we do more of an economic investment and be able to align that with human development. And I think those are some of the things that we would have to apply ourselves to as a result of this pandemic.
Mr. Silva, did you want to come in?
Yes, well, fully agreeing with Moses. I think the pandemic has changed everything in the world, and of course it has had an enormous impact also on the EU-AU relationship, but it has shown us even more the greater interdependence between the two continents. And I think this point of human development is really fundamental. And we've tried, as the Portuguese presidency of the European Union, to bring this to the forefront, to say that we need to build back better, yes, so we need to incorporate the let's say newer dimensions of the green, the digital, a different form also of economic relationship, but we can't forget that we, in a certain way, we need to go back to basics also, to create very solid foundations in the health sectors and in the education sectors, because only if we have those two strategic, let's say, sectors consolidate, will African societies be able to thrive, also because of their extremely young populations. And in our dialogues also with the Commission, I think we have managed, let's say, to persuade them also on the importance of this dimension, and this has been incorporated, and I think now there's a general consensus. But the COVID has shown that Europe and Africa, I think, need each other even much more than in the past.
Josiane, may I come in on this one?
Please.
Thank you so much. I'd like to take us a little bit back to the question, which was about, have we moved on from a neoliberal paradigm? And to bounce back on what Mr. Da Silva said, and I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to disagree slightly with what you said, just to spice things up a bit. The EU, indeed, almost the moment COVID struck, decided that, we're going to need to build back better. Personally, we're a little bit concerned even about the idea of building back, because we don't want to build back. We want to rebuild better, because building back suggests we'll just do more of what we did before. And then we don't move on from the neoliberal paradigm that we had before, that was failing everybody and creating very flawed societies and systems. And unfortunately, I don't think that we have really moved on in our thinking. I don't think the EU has moved much beyond, for example, a focus on GDP growth as the reason for the economy and what we're going to be, all heading towards. And yet we know that GDP growth does not create more well-being for people, and it has caused a lot of environmental damage. Now, I fully take on board and we really support everything that the EU is doing on the climate and with the Green Deal. But I think what we need to also look at now is how can we actually reorient the economy and the way the economy functions so that it really prioritizes people and planet. It puts people and planet first, not profit and privilege and power. I think that if we reorient the economy, it's going to help us to address many of the issues that we're facing today, like huge inequalities. And let's face it, economic growth and the way the economy has functioned and been encouraged to function, let's say, over the last few decades, that has been one of the main causes of the huge inequalities that we see now, both between people, but also between countries. So what I would welcome going forward is a really completely different way of envisaging what the economy is for and how we create economic progress.
Thank you, Tanya. As we're coming to the end of our time together, and I do want to respect the schedule and everybody's need for a proper break, I first want to thank all of the wonderful panelists. I want to thank you for your generosity, for your sharing, for your intellectual openness, and also your emotional engagement in the discussion. It was felt, I think, we're getting used to being online and we're managing even to come across and connect, which is something quite surprising actually on a human level, but it's nice to see and feel it even across the screen. Maybe I could just share a few keywords, because the idea was, of course, to say how do we progress towards a more genuine and meaningful Africa-EU partnership or relationship, or and how do we shift that power imbalance into something meaningful and genuine. And there were a lot of words that came out today that may guide that process of reflection, because I think today is mostly about process of reflection and trying to move in that direction, not about finding the answers, of course. And there'll be more discussions this afternoon to take us a little further. But I heard about voice, I heard about co-creating, about honesty, about trust, about listening. Listening came back a lot, about people. So really, one-to-one relationships being very important as a starting block of the bigger institutional relationships, about value, about interdependence, recognizing our interdependence and our need for each other, which is a very important element. Ownership, also autonomy though, and recognizing the power and the privilege and the narrative that has been part of the system that we've been in. So maybe just recognizing that all those words matter and that they can help us to think further. I think we've come to the end of our panel, so thank you so much.
Also, thank you from my side to all speakers, presenters, Josiane for facilitating, and of course also you, everybody who participated and listened to this interesting debate and who sent maybe some questions or some comments in the chat or the Q&A. We are taking a lunch break, and you will be happy to hear that we have foreseen a 2-hour lunch break. So for the people who are in the Greenwich Mean Time +1, we'll see you back at 2. For the people who are in the Central European time zone, we'll see you back at 3. And all the others, you'll have to find out when it is for you, because I cannot name all time zones. But enjoy your lunch if you can. Get away in front of the computer, stretch your legs, and I'll see you back in 2 hours.